The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Miller's Coffee House, casting long shadows across the worn wooden tables where customers sat nursing their drinks and conversations. In the corner booth near the back, 72-year-old Frank Morrison sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a simple black coffee mug. His gray hair was neatly combed, his clothes clean but modest, and on his left forearm, barely visible beneath his rolled-up flannel sleeve, was a faded tattoo that had seen better decades. The coffee shop buzzed with the usual mix of college students, remote workers, and afternoon regulars. Behind the counter, 23-year-old Jake Peterson wiped down the espresso machine with the confident swagger of someone who believed his part-time barista job and expensive tattoo sleeves made him an expert on ink and life in general. His arms were covered in vibrant, professionally done artwork that he never missed an opportunity to show off or discuss with anyone who would listen. Frank had been coming to Miller's for months now, always ordering the same black coffee, always sitting in the same corner booth, always keeping to himself. He never bothered anyone, never complained about anything, and always left a generous tip despite his obviously modest means. The regulars had grown accustomed to his quiet presence, but Jake had only recently started working there and hadn't yet learned to appreciate the value of respectful silence. As Jake finished his cleaning duties, his eyes wandered to the old man in the corner booth. Something about Frank's stillness annoyed him, the way the elderly veteran sat there so quietly, so unremarkably. When Jake's gaze fell on the faded tattoo on Frank's forearm, he felt a surge of superiority that he couldn't contain. "Hey, old-timer," Jake called out across the coffee shop, his voice cutting through the ambient conversations and causing several heads to turn. "That tattoo on your arm there. Man, that thing looks rough. Who did that work for you? A prison artist?" Frank looked up slowly, his weathered face showing no anger, only a quiet resignation that suggested he'd heard worse things in his lifetime. "It's pretty old," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. Jake wasn't satisfied with that response. He walked over to Frank's table, wiping his hands on his apron with theatrical flair. "I mean, no offense, but that thing is seriously amateur hour. Look at this," he said, rolling up his own sleeve to display a vibrant dragon that wrapped around his bicep. "This is what real tattoo work looks like. Cost me $800, but you get what you pay for, you know." Several customers had stopped their conversations to watch the uncomfortable exchange. An elderly woman at a nearby table frowned disapprovingly at Jake's behavior, while a young couple exchanged glances that clearly said they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Frank glanced at Jake's elaborate tattoo and nodded politely. "That's very nice work," he said without a trace of sarcasm or defensiveness. But Jake was just getting started. The lack of reaction from the old man only seemed to fuel his need to prove his superiority. "I mean, what even is that thing supposed to be?" he continued, pointing at Frank's faded tattoo. "It looks like someone drew it with a ballpoint pen. And those numbers there, what is that? Your prison ID or something?" The coffee shop had grown noticeably quieter now, with most conversations dying away as patrons became uncomfortable witnesses to the one-sided verbal assault. Frank's tattoo was indeed faded and simple compared to modern work, but there was something about the design, something about the specific arrangement of symbols and numbers, that would have meant everything to the right person. Unfortunately for Jake, he wasn't the right person. "It's just something from a long time ago," Frank said quietly, pulling his sleeve down slightly as if to hide the source of his embarrassment. Jake laughed, a sound that carried no warmth or humor. "A long time ago is right. Looks like it was done in the Stone Age. You should really consider getting that covered up with some real artwork. I know a guy who could turn that mess into something actually worth looking at." Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. What Jake didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known from his limited perspective and experience, was that Frank Morrison wasn't just any old man with a regrettable tattoo. The faded ink on his forearm told a story that would have humbled anyone with an ounce of understanding about military history and sacrifice. The simple design wasn't the work of an amateur artist or a prison tattoo gun. It was the mark of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, one of the most elite units in the United States Marine Corps. The numbers that Jake had mocked weren't random digits or identification codes. They represented dates and coordinates that were seared into the memory of every Marine who had served in Vietnam's most dangerous reconnaissance missions. Frank's tattoo marked him as one of the legendary Force Recon Marines, the eyes and ears of the Corps in the deepest, darkest corners of enemy territory. At 72, Frank Morrison was a recipient of the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star with V for Valor and 3 Purple Hearts. He had spent 13 months in the jungles of Vietnam, leading small teams of Marines on missions so classified that their existence was barely acknowledged even decades later. He had saved the lives of countless fellow Marines, had been wounded in action multiple times, and had earned the respect and admiration of every warrior who had ever served alongside him. But Frank had never been one to talk about his service. He had returned from Vietnam to a country that didn't welcome its warriors home with parades and praise. He had quietly built a life, raised a family, and worked as a mechanic for 40 years without ever seeking recognition or glory. The tattoo on his arm was the only outward sign of the brotherhood he had belonged to, the only visible reminder of the young Marines he had led through hell and back. As Jake continued his verbal assault in the coffee shop, something was already beginning to happen beyond the walls of Miller's Coffee House. It started with Tommy Martinez, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who happened to be walking past the large front window when he saw the confrontation taking place inside. Tommy couldn't hear the words being spoken, but he could see the body language, could see an elderly man being confronted by a young punk who clearly didn't understand who he was dealing with. Tommy pulled out his phone and opened the Marine Corps League group chat that connected dozens of local veterans. His message was simple: "Need eyes on Miller's Coffee House on Elm Street. Looks like one of our own is getting hassled by some punk kid." The response was immediate. Within minutes, ones were buzzing across the city as Marines who had been going about their ordinary Saturday afternoon received the call that one of their brothers needed backup. It didn't matter that they didn't know Frank personally. It didn't matter that some of them were busy with family obligations or work responsibilities. When a Marine calls for help, other Marines respond. Staff Sergeant Mike Chun was detailing his car in his driveway when his phone buzzed. He read Tommy's message, looked at the photos that other Marines were already posting from outside the coffee shop, and immediately recognized something that made his blood run cold. In one of the grainy photos taken through the window, he could just make out the faded tattoo on the old man's arm. Mike had spent enough time studying Marine Corps history to recognize the distinctive design of the 1st Recon Battalion insignia. He had heard the stories, the legends of the Force Recon Marines who had operated behind enemy lines in Vietnam. If his eyes weren't deceiving him, the old man being humiliated in that coffee shop was one of the ghosts, one of the legendary warriors whose exploits were still whispered about in Marine Corps training schools. Mike's fingers flew across his phone screen as he sent out an urgent message to every Marine contact in his phone. "This is not a drill. We have a Force Recon Vietnam vet being disrespected at Miller's Coffee House. I repeat, this is a Force Recon Marine. All available Marines report immediately." The effect was electric. Across the city, Marines began dropping whatever they were doing and heading toward Elm Street. Some were active duty personnel who happened to be off base for the weekend. Others were veterans spanning 5 decades of service, from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. They came in pickup trucks and motorcycles, in uniform and civilian clothes, united by a bond that transcended age, rank, and background. Colonel Sarah Williams, retired, was enjoying a quiet afternoon with her grandchildren when her phone exploded with notifications. As she read the messages flooding in, her expression grew serious. She had spent her entire career in the Marine Corps, had commanded thousands of Marines over the years, but she had never lost sight of the debt that every modern Marine owed to the warriors who had come before them. The Force Recon Marines of Vietnam were legends, myths almost, whose stories were told in hushed tones at Marine Corps birthday balls and veteran gatherings. These were the Marines who had operated alone behind enemy lines, who had lived for months in the jungle gathering intelligence and calling in airstrikes. They had suffered casualty rates that were almost incomprehensible, and those who survived had earned a place in Marine Corps history that bordered on the sacred. Colonel Williams called her driver and headed straight for Miller's Coffee House. Meanwhile, inside the coffee shop, Jake's performance was reaching new heights of cruelty. The young barista had apparently decided that the lack of response from the old man meant he could push even further. "Honestly, I'm embarrassed for you," Jake said, his voice carrying across the now silent coffee shop. Walking around with that thing on your arm like it means something. At least have the decency to keep it covered up so the rest of us don't have to look at it. Frank's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown since the harassment began. But still he said nothing, still he maintained the quiet dignity that had carried him through decades of challenges far greater than this one. Other customers were beginning to speak up now. The elderly woman at the nearby table finally found her voice. "Young man, that's quite enough. Leave him alone." But Jake was too intoxicated by his own perceived power to listen to reason. "Hey, I'm just being honest here. If nobody tells him, how's he going to know? I'm actually doing him a favor." What Jake didn't know was that outside Miller's coffee house, a formation was beginning to take shape that would have made him wet himself if he had bothered to look out the window. Marines were arriving steadily now, parking their vehicles and forming up on the sidewalk with the kind of precision and purpose that only comes from years of military training. Tommy Martinez had taken charge of the informal operation, positioning Marines at strategic points around the coffee shop while maintaining a respectful distance. These weren't vigilantes looking for a fight. These were disciplined warriors who understood the importance of proportional response and appropriate action. As more Marines arrived, word began to spread about the identity of the man being harassed inside. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, who had served with 1st Recon in Iraq, was the first to make a positive identification when he got a clear look through the window. "That's Frank Morrison," he whispered to the growing crowd of Marines. "Frank Ghost Morrison. He's a legend. Saved my dad's life in Vietnam. My father told me stories about this guy that would make your hair stand on end." The news rippled through the assembled Marines like an electric current. They weren't just looking at any elderly veteran being disrespected. Why were looking at one of their Corps' greatest heroes, a man whose actions in combat had become the stuff of legend, being humiliated by a punk kid who didn't know enough to recognize true greatness when it was sitting right in front of him. Major Peterson, no relation to the barista despite sharing a last name, arrived with a car full of active-duty Marines from the nearby base. When he saw the size of the crowd that had already assembled, when he understood who was inside the coffee shop, he knew that this situation required careful handling. "Listen up," he said quietly to the assembled Marines. "We're going to handle this the right way. No violence, no threats, no confrontation. We're Marines, and we conduct ourselves like Marines. But that man in there deserves our respect and our protection, and he's going to get both." Inside the coffee shop, Jake's tirade was finally winding down, not because he had developed any sense of decency, but because he was running out of creative ways to insult an old man's tattoo. He stood there grinning at Frank, apparently expecting some kind of response or acknowledgement of his wit. Frank Morrison, recipient of the Navy Cross, veteran of 13 months in hell, leader of Marines in the deepest darkness of war, simply looked up at Jake with eyes that had seen things the young man couldn't imagine. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a weight that made even Jake pause. "You're entitled to your opinion," Frank said simply. It was then that Jake made his fatal mistake. Instead of accepting the gracious response and walking away, instead of recognizing that he had already gone too far, he decided to push one final time. "You know what?" Jake said, his voice rising with renewed confidence. "I bet that tattoo doesn't even mean anything. I bet you just got it to look tough, to pretend you were something you're not. What are you going to tell me next, that you're some kind of war hero?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every customer in the coffee shop, every person within earshot, seemed to hold their breath. Frank Morrison looked at Jake for a long moment, and for just an instant, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but something that might have been pity. "I never said I was a hero," Frank replied quietly. That was the moment when the door to Miller's coffee house opened and Tommy Martinez walked in, followed by Mike Chin, followed by a steady stream of Marines who filled the small space with their presence. They didn't march in formation, they didn't shout or make threats. They simply entered and took positions throughout the coffee shop, their bearing and demeanor making it immediately clear that something significant was happening. Jake looked around in confusion as more and more military personnel filled the space. Some were in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but all carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of United States Marines. His cocky grin began to fade as he realized that his audience had changed dramatically. Colonel Williams was among the last to enter, her silver hair and dignified bearing commanding immediate respect from every Marine in the room. She surveyed the scene, her experienced eyes taking in Jake's confused expression and Frank's quiet dignity, and she understood the situation immediately. She walked directly to Frank's table, and what happened next would be talked about in Marine Corps circles for years to come. Colonel Williams came to attention and rendered a perfect salute to the elderly man sitting in the corner booth. Colonel Williams, United States Marine Corps, retired, she announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the coffee shop. "Sir, it is an honor to meet you." Frank Morrison looked up at her with surprise, then slowly rose from his seat and returned the salute with precision that showed his years of service. "Frank Morrison, Force Recon, retired," he replied. The effect on the assembled Marines was immediate and profound. Every Marine in the room came to attention. Every Marine in the room understood that they were in the presence of legend. And every Marine in the room turned to look at Jake Peterson with expressions that made him wish he could disappear into the floor. Colonel Williams turned to address Jake directly, her voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded thousands of Marines over a distinguished career. "Young man," she said, "I don't think you understand what you've been doing here today. The gentleman you've been mocking, the tattoo you've been ridiculing, represents something that you clearly don't comprehend. That amateur artwork you've been criticizing is the mark of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, one of the most elite units in the United States Marine Corps." Jake's face had gone pale, but Colonel Williams wasn't finished. "The numbers you joked about, the symbols you dismissed, they represent 13 months of combat operations in Vietnam, where this man led Marines into enemy territory on missions so dangerous that most of them were classified for decades. That faded ink you found so amusing marks him as one of the Force Recon Marines who saved countless American lives by gathering intelligence behind enemy lines." She paused, letting her words sink in while Jake stood frozen in place. "This man," Colonel Williams continued, gesturing toward Frank, "is a recipient of the Navy Cross, our Corps' second highest decoration for valor. He has 3 Purple Hearts, meaning he was wounded in action 3 separate times while serving his country. He has a Bronze Star with V for valor, meaning he distinguished himself through heroic acts under fire. The prison numbers you mocked represent coordinates where he called in artillery strikes that saved the lives of surrounded Marines." The coffee shop was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Jake's mouth had fallen open, and his face had gone from pale to red as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. "Every Marine in this room," Colonel Williams said, her voice rising slightly, "owes a debt to men like Frank Morrison. Every freedom you enjoy, every peaceful night's sleep you take for granted, exists because warriors like him were willing to go into the darkness so that you could live in the light." She turned to look at the assembled Marines, then back to Jake. "What you witnessed here today was not just rudeness or ignorance. It was a profound disrespect for sacrifice and service that you cannot possibly comprehend. These Marines didn't come here to threaten you or to cause trouble. They came here because when one of their brothers is disrespected, they respond. That's what brotherhood means. That's what honor looks like." Jake finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I'm sorry, I had no idea." Frank Morrison stood up slowly, his weathered hands steady despite his age. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, he looked directly at Jake. "Son," Frank said quietly, "you couldn't have known. But maybe next time, before you judge someone by appearances, you might consider that every person has a story. Every person has value. And sometimes the most important stories are carried by the quietest people." The young barista nodded frantically, tears beginning to form in his eyes as the weight of his actions hit him fully. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say." Colonel Williams stepped forward again. "What you can do," she said to Jake, "is learn from this. What you can do is remember that respect isn't something you give only to people who look impressive or successful by your standards. What you can do is understand that true warriors don't need to advertise their accomplishments because they know that the real reward for service is the service itself." She gestured to the assembled Marines. These men and women didn't come here for glory or recognition. They came here because they understand what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. They understand that when you wear the eagle, globe, and anchor, you become part of a brotherhood that transcends time and circumstance. Major Peterson stepped forward and addressed Frank directly. "Sir, it would be our honor if you would allow us to buy your coffee today. And if you're willing, some of us would very much like to hear about your service." Frank looked around at the faces of the Marines surrounding him, young and old, male and female, representing decades of service to their country. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, he smiled. "I'd like that," he said simply. What happened next transformed Miller's Coffee House from a place of embarrassment into a place of honor. The Marines arranged themselves around Frank's table, with the younger ones sitting on the floor and the senior personnel taking chairs. Jake, still shaken by the revelation of his mistake, quietly prepared coffee for everyone and refused to accept payment from any of them. Frank Morrison, who had been silent about his service for decades, began to share stories that held his audience spellbound. He spoke about the young Marines he had led through the jungles of Vietnam, about the missions that had pushed them to the limits of human endurance, about the brotherhood that had sustained them through the darkest moments of their lives. He talked about Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who had saved Frank's life by throwing himself on a grenade, and whose son was now a gunnery sergeant serving with honor. He spoke about Corporal Williams, no relation to the colonel, who had carried a wounded Marine for 3 miles through enemy territory to reach an extraction point. He remembered Private First Class Chun, whose uncle was now Staff Sergeant Chun, who had volunteered for every dangerous mission because he couldn't bear the thought of letting his fellow Marines face danger alone. As Frank spoke, Jake Peterson listened from behind the counter, learning more about courage, sacrifice, and honor in 2 hours than he had learned in his entire life. He understood now that the faded tattoo he had mocked was not just ink and skin, but a sacred mark that connected Frank to a brotherhood of warriors who had earned their place in history through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still the Marines remained, reluctant to leave the presence of a legend who had finally found his voice. Frank's stories were not boastful or self-aggrandizing. They were humble accounts of ordinary Marines doing extraordinary things because their brothers needed them to do extraordinary things. When the gathering finally began to break up, each Marine took a moment to shake Frank's hand and thank him for his service. Colonel Williams was the last to leave, and she had one final message for both Frank and Jake. "Frank," she said, "thank you for reminding us all what it means to serve with quiet dignity. Your example today was worth more than any lecture I could give about Marine Corps values." She turned to Jake. "And you, young man, you've been given a gift today. You've been shown what real strength looks like, what real courage means. Don't waste that gift." As the Marines filed out of Miller's Coffee House, Jake approached Frank's table one final time. The elderly veteran was gathering his things, preparing to leave, when the young barista cleared his throat nervously. "Sir," Jake said, his voice still shaky with emotion, "I know I can't take back what I said, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'll never forget what happened here today. I'll never forget what you taught me about respect and dignity and what it really means to be a hero." Frank Morrison looked at Jake for a long moment, then extended his weathered hand. "We all make mistakes, son. The measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes. It's what he does after he realizes he's made them." Jake shook the old Marine's hand with a grip that conveyed his gratitude and his newfound respect. "Your coffee is free here forever, sir. And I mean that." Frank smiled. "That's very kind of you. But I'll pay for my coffee. A man pays his own way when he can." As Frank Morrison walked out of Miller's Coffee House that evening, his steps seemed a little lighter, his shoulders a little straighter. For the first time in decades, he had been reminded that his service mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning, that the brotherhood he had belonged to was still alive and strong. Jake Peterson watched him go, then looked down at his own elaborately tattooed arms. The artwork that had seemed so important to him that morning now looked different somehow. It was still beautiful, still skillfully done, but it told no story beyond his own vanity. It represented no sacrifice, no service, no commitment to anything greater than himself. That night, Jake began researching the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, reading about their missions in Vietnam, learning about the incredible courage and sacrifice of the Force Recon Marines. The more he learned, the more he understood the magnitude of his mistake and the grace that Frank Morrison had shown in forgiving him. The story of what happened at Miller's Coffee House spread quickly through the local Marine community and beyond. It became a lesson in the importance of respect, a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated. It became a testament to the enduring bonds of military brotherhood and the power of collective action in defense of honor and dignity. Frank Morrison continued to visit Miller's Coffee House every Saturday afternoon, always ordering the same black coffee, always sitting in the same corner booth. But now he was no longer alone. Marines would stop by to share a cup of coffee with him, to hear his stories, to benefit from his wisdom and experience. The quiet corner booth became an informal gathering place for warriors of all ages, a place where the bonds of brotherhood were strengthened and the lessons of service were passed from one generation to the next. And Jake Peterson, humbled by his encounter with true greatness, became one of Frank's most devoted listeners. He learned that real strength comes not from the ability to tear others down, but from the courage to build them up. He learned that true warriors don't need to advertise their toughness because their actions speak louder than any words. Most importantly, he learned that respect is not something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it, but something you give freely because every person carries within them a story of struggle, sacrifice, and dignity that deserves to be honored. The faded tattoo on Frank Morrison's arm never changed. It remained simple, understated, and weathered by time. But for those who knew how to read it, it told a story of courage under fire, of brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat, of sacrifice made willingly for the love of country and fellow Marines. It was not just ink and skin, but a sacred arcade that connected Frank to every Marine who had ever worn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, and to every American who had ever slept safely because warriors like him were willing to stand watch in the darkness. In the end, the young barista's cruel words had accomplished something that decades of quiet dignity had not. They had forced Frank Morrison to step out of the shadows and claim his rightful place among the honored warriors of the Marine Corps. They had reminded him that his service mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning, and that the brotherhood he belonged to would never abandon him. And perhaps most importantly, they had taught everyone who witnessed the events at Miller's Coffee House that day that true heroism is not about seeking recognition or glory. It is about doing what is right, serving others, and maintaining your dignity and honor even when faced with disrespect and ignorance. Frank Morrison's tattoo might have been faded and simple, but the character it represented was as strong and enduring as the Corps itself.